Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I am joined by Dr. William Hannas, who is the lead analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET. Before joining CSET, he served in the Senior Intelligence Service at the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm also joined by my colleague Hugh Grant-Chapman, a fellow within our economics program here at CSIS. In this episode, we will discuss Bill's new and published CSET report, China's Embodied AI, A Path to AGI, and findings from Hugh's forthcoming CSIS report on Chinese robotics. Bill and Hugh, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.
So I'd like to start with a teaser question for both of you, and that is, what have you found most interesting or most surprising when observing China's emerging technology over the past year? And again, this should be separate from the findings of either of your reports.
My team at Georgetown tries to keep an eye on Chinese AI developments to avoid surprise. And we do this by focusing on Chinese primary sources, where interesting developments typically appear earlier than in English. Also, China's government has this helpful habit of announcing what it plans to do in advance of it happening for anyone watching. Still, there were a few things that raised our eyebrows. One is the speed with which China has been carrying out its plans for AI diffusion. Another was the appearance in the city of Wuhan of an AI-based large-scale social simulator, a complex multi-agent system aimed at creating a digital version of a parallel world to model and then optimize most aspects of the city's production, commerce, and social intercourse. Yes, you heard that right. A third interesting development is the rise in a number of Chinese authored AI papers in top journals and conferences. The true stats depend on who is counting what, but a ballpark figure is half or more of the top papers have authors who claim PRC affiliation, and another large chunk of the remainder have authors with Chinese names but affiliations outside China. Note that I didn't mention DeepSeek, which has been overhyped and was mostly predictable, although their decision to open source its R1 code is paying off in market share.
Well said, Bill. I think those are all great points. I would just add one more that I think has come as a surprise to me this year, and that's not necessarily on the pace of China's emerging technology innovation itself, but how it is choosing to use that. I think if you look at the past couple of years, we've seen a fairly steady trajectory of rapid innovation, intensive R&D efforts to climb domestic value chains. A recent pivot in that, or an additional aspect of China's use of emerging technologies, is its application in its traditional and legacy industries. I think in our conversation, we're probably going to touch a little bit on how AI is being used in manufacturing and other parts of China's economy. That's sort of where my background lies. And I think one of the things I did not expect to see this year, but is increasingly an important part of China's economic approach, is the use of emerging technologies to essentially revive or revitalize traditional or legacy industries, which many observers maybe originally thought would be allowed to play a smaller role going forward. But we're seeing that's actually not necessarily the case.
Bill, can I follow up really quickly on the second interesting finding you had, which is the Wuhan social simulator? Is that a digital version of everything, as in there are also folks in this simulator who are trying to work in this world?
That's the goal. We did a whole paper on that about half a year ago. It hasn't been covered much in the English language press. There's been a fair amount of reporting in the Chinese press. It's spearheaded by a couple of big names in China AI right now. And the goal is, replicate everything, absolutely everything. Now, of course, that's not going to happen, and it'll take some doing, a lot of work. But that's what they plan to do, optimize everything. It sounds Orwellian, probably with reason. Not only that, Wuhan is the test bed. They're also moving it to other cities. They have a plan to spread it throughout all of China. So it's a bit disconcerting, I have to say.
Wow, that is amazing. And I think that definitely deserves much more research and perhaps a different podcast episode just on that development itself. But for today, we're focusing on the general topic of embodied AI, which derives from Bill's excellent paper. Maybe, Bill, let me start with you. What is actually embodied AI? And why is it viewed as a critical pathway toward achieving artificial general intelligence in China?
My team prefers to let the Chinese researchers do the speaking for us. Here's a great definition by two of their leaders, the leading figures. Quote, embodied intelligence refers to an intelligent system that perceives and acts based on the physical body. It obtains information, understands problems, makes decisions, and takes action through the interaction between the intelligent agent and the environment, thereby generating intelligent behavior and adaptability. It helps to look at the Chinese term for AGI, 通用人工智能, literally general use artificial intelligence. The second morpheme there, yung, by itself means use. Now, without going too far down the semantic rabbit hole, it's enough to point out that intelligence in China is not some reified abstraction, but is linked to tangible phenomena. Now, this plays out in how Chinese scientists view AI. Higher cognition in humans is performed symbolically. That is, it is language-based. Now, you can get quite far, really far, by juggling words and phrases, either in your head or in the artificial neural networks on which AI runs. But at the end of the day, these concepts need to be rooted in reality, more precisely in sensory data. In humans, that's a given. Concepts are built up from experience. In LLMs, the link with reality is inferred. It's an imperfect abstraction of what humans in our recorded language and art have imperfectly characterized. So what you get from large language models, even multimodal LLMs, are second-order representations, useful for sure, but prone to inaccuracies or worse, plausible inaccuracies. Now, embodying AI in applications that learn by interacting with the physical world or with a good simulation of the world allows intelligence to accrue that is more reliable, traceable, and limited only by the environment to which it is exposed, which is to say, limitless. And while the embodied AI learns, it can potentially share what it learns with other AIs, including LLMs trained on data and other embodied AIs working on different problems in different environments. The process snowballs, and you end up theoretically with AGI.
Bill, you already touched on this a little bit, but what are the key differences or limitations with today's focus on large language models, the LLMs that you're referring to? And how is China trying to address those weaknesses through embodied AI?
Well, for starters, they hallucinate. They lack common sense. I'm talking now about the large language models, even the large multimodal language models. They lack common sense. They do not yet reason very well. They're obscenely expensive, and they can't extrapolate much beyond what they were trained on. That is, they don't generalize well. Embedding AI in applications not only eliminates the root cause of many technical problems, it's also more cost-effective. The economic viability of embodied AI supporting real applications is a given, not something to be hyped to a skeptical audience. China's rapid move to embodied AI is part of a broader effort promoted by China's premier AI research labs to turn the Western formula of, quote, big data, small task, unquote, on its head. It also reflects China's millennia-old cognitive preference to seek practical uses for knowledge, not knowledge that is larger LLMs for its own sake.
Could you share some of the prime examples of embodied AI or China's application of embodied AI?
There are many examples from China's perspective of embodiment. The ones that we wrote about were the ones that captured the headlines, specifically robotics, and we're talking humanoid robotics, factory robots, unmanned aerial vehicles, driverless automobiles.
I might just pop in here. I think one of the really interesting things that leapt out in your report, Bill, is that, yes, you sort of foreground robotics as a prominent application, and that's sort of my area of research. But it's not just that. You know, you give a couple instances of something like what's sometimes called a digital twin or sort of other digital first AI tools. And that's essentially what you were saying at the top with the Wuhan example of basically a digital parallel version of all these different aspects of the physical thing. It could be a factory, it could be a car that then is sort of used to simulate or to manage, operate the physical counterpart. So I just thought that's good to think about, that when Chinese policymakers talk about embodied AI, robots are a part of that, but it's actually a slightly broader concept.
In terms of looking at the many ways in which China is thinking about embodied AI, what kinds of capabilities does embodiment unlock that we don't see large language models being able to do alone?
Well, it's basically limitless. in principle, can act autonomously in the environment within which it's operating and expand its capabilities at the same time. It learns while it works. That's the key point as we see it. Not only does embodied AI perform useful real-world functions, it also becomes smarter while doing so. If, or rather when, China figures out how to aggregate the knowledge generated by millions of these embodied implementations, it's hard to deny the likelihood of some form of AGI, artificial general intelligence, emerging. Or to go a step further, the emergence even of artificial superintelligence that surpasses human intelligence in all domains. It's taken seriously in Chinese AI circles by top academics. We tend to scoff at it, but it's taken seriously there. Another feature often overlooked is that intelligence encompasses more than the cerebral processes needed, for example, to ace the SAT, to converse with a human, to prove equations, or make a cup of coffee. There are also social, emotional, and motivational intelligences, which run on dedicated neural circuits in mammals and promote survival in real environments. Embodied AI replicates the process by which these other intelligences become part of our human makeup by interacting with real environments.
Oh, that's so fascinating. So in many ways, an embodied AI robot or embodied AI platform is going to be much smarter than just humans because they're also replicating other types of intelligence that we see in animals that not necessarily humans.
It depends on how you define smart. I can easily envision LLMs progressing to the point where you've got a super intelligence of some sort that lacks other qualities that are part and parcel of the human condition. That could happen. It probably will, as a matter of fact. But one thing they don't do well is emulate these other forms of intelligence that are native to the human condition or mammals in general, social, emotional, and motivation. Whereas the embodied intelligence has a better chance of replicating that.
Okay, let me now turn to what exactly is the Chinese government doing. So we know that there has been a wave of policies prioritizing embodied AI at the national level within China as well as at the municipal and local levels. What does this reveal about what China is trying to do longer term with respect to its AI strategy? Where does embodied AI fit within all of this?
The PRC national government articulates the general features of China's AI programs. It allocates funding or defines how the funding should take place, facilitates downstream implementation, and it makes mid-course corrections as needed. That said, they don't have a crystal ball. China's AI policy is not cooked up by technocrats and forced on the nation. Chinese scientists and entrepreneurs enjoy a great deal of autonomy in their research and have access to top-level decision makers who sometimes fill both roles. Beyond embodiment, which is now the flavor of the day in China, there's also considerable attention given to so-called brain-inspired AI, connectomics to use the technical term, notably brain-computer interfaces, which are envisioned not only as therapeutic, this is a little scary, but for cognitive enhancement. I mean, they actually do have that goal.
So just to add on to that, I think it's been interesting to see the process of regional differentiation within China's approach to its AI policy. What you've seen over the past couple of years is different kind of centers of talent, different centers of innovation, Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, other kind of prominent players, take on specialized role within the broader AI and physical AI value chain. So you have maybe like an emphasis on software in Beijing versus like other cities or other locales have maybe strong points in sensors or strong points in motors and motorics or like systems integrators that bring these different elements together. In some ways, that's better than how Chinese industrial policy has been deployed in other sectors, which can often, at its worst, is a lot of different provinces or municipalities all kind of honing in on the same exact area of the value chain and just really competing at an intense race to the bottom. What you're seeing here is a little bit different. There is some higher order organization and some differentiation, which I think is advantageous to the industry development. We can talk about this more in a little bit, but one potential explainer for that is the prevalence of vertical integration in China's leading robotics and physical AI, embodied AI companies.
And Hugh, just to follow up on that, what are you seeing in particular with respect to what China is prioritizing in terms of embodied AI for economic development? I think you mentioned robotics contributing to economic development, but are there any particular industries?
Yeah, definitely. One of the terms that is frequently invoked in these conversations is new quality productive forces. And that is Xi Jinping's sort of term of art for one of a range of different technologies that he believes and the Chinese central government believe are going to be drivers of China's future economic development strategy. There's a few things that are meant to be achieved through that framework. One is driving continued innovation in scientific research. Second is plugging into existing industries, predominantly the manufacturing sector. And then the third is addressing a range of structural challenges that China's economy is facing. So that could include things like demographic decline and aging population, or an attempt to shift toward more of a services economy, or efforts to boost wages. And so how does embodied AI fit within that? I think in the manufacturing sector, which is what I'll sort of emphasize here, it's making firms more efficient, allowing more output to be produced for a given amount of labor, given the demographic decline challenge, and allow Chinese manufacturers to manufacture more high-value goods, and through that mechanism, boost income, boost wages, and sort of in an adjacent policy goal, boost tax revenue for governments, central and local governments. And that's an area where I think you see kind of early leadership in the Chinese industry of sort of being like, we're going to get this model out first, whether it's like a robotic system out first or something like that. Even if it's not fully autonomous and it still has some sort of human input that it falls back on, even still that can be useful for gathering that data and solving kind of this data shortage issue, which is a common issue in embodied AI research, which then kind of is a key ingredient for future iterations of these kind of algorithms.
We've talked about the economic application of embodied AI. Are you seeing any examples in which China is applying embodied AI to national defense, to foreign policy, or to a field that you're very, very familiar with, which is intelligence analysis? I think you mentioned UAVs earlier, so I think that could be an example in the national security space.
Typically in unclassified materials, even Chinese language documents, you don't find extended discussions or references to how this or that technology is going to be applied to weapons. You see it once in a while. So drones, of course, and everybody knows about that. But in the literature that we looked at, we see a dedicated research happening in embodied AI on decision-making. There's potential military application there for sure. Sensing and control, yes and yes. Space exploration, absolutely. Navigation, path planning, yes. And these hint at military and intelligence operations. But I haven't seen anything more concrete than that in terms of how they will apply this to defense.
And Hugh, earlier you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, you said there's less data on embodied AI. Can you just explain what does that refer to?
Sure, yeah, great question. So think of the parallel between the LLMs, the chat GPTs that we know and love today, and an AI model that's used to, say, pilot a robot. One of the huge advantages of kind of these large language models that primarily deal in text is that they had an entire internet worth of textual data that they could train on. And so the companies that really led this took all that data, scraped it through one way or another, and compiled that into a data set, which was then used to train these models. There is no parallel to like an internet for this physical data. So if you think about like the kind of data that a robotic system might need, it's spatial data. It's like this three-dimensional mapping of its surroundings. It's mobility data. If it's, say, a humanoid robot, like how do you move the different joints? How do you navigate a space? And then there's this kind of like higher order executive planning of, okay, I'm here and I have this package in my hands. Where do I got to go put it in the factory floor? You put all that together and there's really no parallel to that, or no like large, readily available source of data that you can use to train those kind of models. And so what you're forced to do is essentially often collect that data firsthand. And you see instances today of early commercial applications of embodied AI often have a human kind of like somewhere offside or somewhere behind the scenes that's actually helping to pilot that robot. And so maybe you have a robot barista, but then it's actually like a human barista who's controlling that remotely, something like that. And you might say, well, isn't that kind of deceptive, or you reflect poorly on China's AI ecosystem if it sort of can't quite do what it advertises. And to some extent, yeah, it's a little bit of chasing hype, chasing enthusiasm, but a sort of a adjacent goal of that kind of a partial automation is to collect that data from the human who's piloting the robot and store that up with the hopes that in the future, that can then be used to train and refine the model.
In terms of hurdles that China's embodied AI industry has to face, I mean, you just listed one, Hugh, in terms of collecting data and how that is different from just the large LLM models. What other major advantages or risks do you see in China's approach? Maybe, Bill, I'll turn to you first on this.
We don't see any long-term downsides to the venture, and we do see a lot of promise. Getting embodied AIs to communicate with one another, to combine what each has learned, generalize the knowledge for use in new areas, getting the apparatus to bootstrap itself. These are technical challenges, not conceptual challenges, which time and investment will probably overcome. But China's not putting all eggs in one basket. That point has to be emphasized. It continues to do the same LLM research done in the United States, has its own talent base, and is adept at monitoring and importing AI breakthroughs achieved outside China.
Partly because I'm looking at this from an economics point of view, but I think that it certainly helps that China's robotics industry is pursuing more commercial applications on a quicker timescale. If you think about market size that can be used to create this flywheel effect, China has a massive manufacturing industry, and that manufacturing industry creates a huge pool of domestic demand for early automation systems, which then can be used to kind of jumpstart that flywheel, provide avenues of commercial viability for these research areas, and then accelerate innovation in that way. A lot of the companies that are moving quickest in the robotics space have a great deal of prior manufacturing expertise in other kinds of things, whether it's like making electric vehicles, making smartphones, or other kinds of high-tech products. And those provide a range of advantages for kicking off commercial scale production of robotics. I think those are the most top advantages that come to mind. In terms of downsides, I would just call out a couple. One, with this sort of rush to commercialize, to go to market, find commercial applications, there's a little bit of a risk that those products sidestep regulatory issues. Just to give an example, on Chinese social media last year in 2025, there was a wave of concern of seeing this crying child talking to an AI-powered toy. For some reason, this toy was about to die, and the AI was saying, it's been so nice to speak with you, and you're going to live on past me. And it's kind of a macabre scene that went viral on Chinese social media, and a lot of people were like, oh my goodness, like who knows what kind of impacts that's having on this 5-year-old's emotional development. We should probably regulate that. And so there's a risk of issues like that where commercial applications kind of get ahead of regulation, which is a potential downside. I do think that Chinese officials are tracking that very closely. And in general, I think they've actually been fairly proactive about regulation and governance, but at the same time, the industry is moving very quickly. The one other downside that I would call out is the risk of essentially pursuing maybe the wrong technical trajectory longer term. I think you see that most of all in this humanoid robotics subsector. There's a lot of different form factors, a lot of different applications, but seeing all of the emphasis around humanoid robots does raise the risk that, if later on down the road, that does not ultimately end up being the most commercially useful kind of robotic system, then it could end up with a lot of heartache for companies that have been pouring capital investment in that sector of the innovation pathway.
Are there any ethical concerns or debates in China about how to use AI or not use AI? We also mentioned earlier about how robotics could help address some of China's demographic issues. Is there any debate within China about how these robots are going to replace humans?
I do know that China does take the AI safety issue very seriously. It's not like a lot of people imagine that they simply don't care what happens. They do care. That the government is aware that there is popular concern with the safety and potential downsides of not just embodied AI, but AI in general. And there is vigorous research into incorporating values. The whole alignment problem is taken seriously across government and industry in China for AI safety.
I completely agree that the central government is paying close attention to these issues of AI governance and regulation. I mean, it comes out unevenly, but just a couple examples. One example of this from a few months ago was new regulation that came out, which requires labeling of AI generated content online. And that's so if you generate an image and you post it on, WeChat or something like that, that needs to have a disclaimer that this was AI generated. I think that's just a very common sense regulation, and it shows that the government's not afraid to take some meat potatoes action to help put some guardrails up. There's other areas in which there is much more reticence, or maybe like on the opposite end, perhaps we'd argue like a too strong approach toward regulation. You get into issues of like regulating values and perspectives on current affairs. All of that you can imagine is a total minefield. In terms of the issue of labor automation and replacing roles that humans have traditionally played within society, it's an area of active, vigorous debate. You can see applications for, say, elderly population, and there's this huge issue where often you have two sets of grandparents that rely on one grandchild to kind of like meet their social needs, emotional needs, as well as financial needs. And people are saying, well, could we use automation tools to alleviate some of this burden on those younger generations? But then you have other societies saying, man, is this not a sign of kind of disrespect to that more senior population? Or is this kind of an issue, raise issues of human dignity? I think that you absolutely see those debates playing out through society right now. In terms of how they are ultimately adjudicated, time will tell, but I think there's pressure to act quickly given just how quickly the industry is moving.
Great. So as we've been talking about different aspects of China's move into embodied AI, how embodied AI can be applied economically based on what we know, how China thinks about regulating embodied AI. How does China's approach differ from that of the United States?
Yeah, we've been leading up to this from the beginning. In a nutshell, it's pretty simple. U.S. companies, the ones we hear about anyway, the big ones, they're focused on achieving artificial general intelligence through large language models. One or more, they do look at some other ways of achieving advanced AI than LLMs, but by and large, that's their focus. Now, China, on the other hand, it sees no contradiction between building AIs for practical use and achieving AGIs through any of half a dozen different potential ways of getting there, including LLMs. And as I mentioned, it regards the former, that is, building AIs for practical use, as a precondition for the latter if it's understood, if the AGI is understood as replicating human level or human equivalent intelligence. So there is that big dichotomy.
And how does this difference in China's approach versus the American approach impact China's geopolitical position or overall standing in the international system? Does that mean that because China is engaging in a lot more experimentation, for example, we see China being able to apply AI in ways that the United States hasn't?
I would call out 4 potential implications. One, this trend that we've seen of interest in using physical AI, physical automation to revitalize established industries does not bode well for areas of geopolitical tension that involve trade grievances. And so the big overarching theme of the past several years, certainly from US-China perspective and China's relationship with many other countries, is allegations of overcapacity, of dumping, of situations where China's manufacturing sector is just producing goods at a cost and a volume that other manufacturers around the world cannot compete with, which then leads to these issues of economic displacement and political grievance. Seeing a model in which artificial intelligence technologies are used to further expand those traditional industries foreshadows potential future risks that, China remains committed to this pathway in spite of geopolitical tensions. And from my perspective, I think we can expect these trade tensions to remain in the near future. A second thing I'd call out is the potential for other countries, particularly other manufacturers around the world, to become more reliant on Chinese robotics technology. If you have a situation where China is a world leader in robotics innovation, then you can envision a scenario where if you're another country and you want to remain competitive in your manufacturing sector, if you have pressure to procure from Chinese tech suppliers or at best pay a premium for alternative suppliers. We're not there yet. By far, most consumers of China's physical AI technologies are domestic consumers, and the amount that it exports still is a quite small ratio of its total output. But that is one potential kind of trajectory for this issue. Third, I would just quickly point out the implications for greater automation in the manufacturing sector for established models of economic development elsewhere in the world. One kind of lesson from history, as if a country is seeking to grow its economy, to climb an economic development ladder, often the kind of classic, very simplified steps of that is you sort of start with your agriculture sector, you enter manufacturing, capital light manufacturing, capital heavy manufacturing, and then ultimately enter into a more services heavy economy. That's very simplified, but you can imagine a world in which if it's harder to enter that intermediate stage of manufacturing because a larger share of that is retained by either done in China or done by Chinese automation technology elsewhere, it really challenges the pathways available for developing economies specifically to pursue their economic development goals.
Is China leading the development of embodied AI, or are there other countries that are more advanced than China?
So we're not really the best people to make these comparisons, but based on what we've seen at conferences on AI, both inside and outside the U.S. government, where industry has been represented, there's very little said about physical AI and applications. It's almost always entirely focused on large models. So if that's any indication, the state of play, I'd have to say China's ahead or we'll be there soon.
I would agree. Early indicators suggest that China is leading embodied AI. There are other countries that have historically played large roles in the robotics sector, Japan, Europe, South Korea. But what China is pursuing with higher levels of software-based automation is really a step beyond what those kind of established leaders are able to do today. It's still the early innings and the field is moving quickly, but China's pace of innovation is unparalleled at the moment.
So, Bill and Hugh, I want to end on one final question. As the United States looks at what China is doing, what recommendations do you have for the United States and our allies and partners? And in particular, should we learn anything from China?
Yeah, we have 3 specific recommendations. The first is pretty obvious. Support a broader range of approaches to advanced AI. That's the preferred euphemism now for AGI. Second, invest in a serious open source monitoring program of Chinese technologies, which we currently and inexplicably lack to avoid surprise and measure our own competitiveness. Third, find some balance between making the best use of Chinese AI talent working in the United States at the cost of some inevitable leakage of proprietary IP to China. What lesson can the U.S. take from what China's doing? Very simple, copy it. China's borrowed U.S. science and technology since the 1950s. Here's a great opportunity to learn from them.
I would add a couple on to that. One, from the U.S. perspective, as we noted earlier, the U.S. embodied AI sector, if you call it that, is extremely small and lags in development quite a bit when compared to China's. That's partly because the U.S. does not have the same manufacturing sector that can act as a demand-side driver for these kinds of technologies, and partly just because it's not where we've chosen to invest for the past few decades in our tech ecosystem. Seeing this, I think that it really raises pressure for if U.S. firms want to remain competitive and play a role in this increasingly important value chain, they need to be working with partner economies that have a stronger foothold in robotics and embodied AI. Specifically, Europe, Japan, and South Korea are really 3 regions that are established kind of global leaders in this market. And I think that going forward, deeper tech sharing initiatives, deeper partnerships to work closely with suppliers in those countries and regions is probably the most promising path forward, rather than try to sort of go it alone and create a new industry in the US from a very small starting point. Second, I would completely echo the point on we need to be pursuing a more diverse set of pathways for tech development in the AI sector. I think, as Bill has very aptly summarized, a lot of the emphasis in the past few years has been on large language models, high capital investment, large computing clusters. And it could pan out that that is ultimately what we need to get to more advanced forms of automation, but it might not be. And I think there's a risk that we sort of close ourselves off to other avenues of tech innovation if we sort of pursue this one node approach.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bill and Hugh, for this very in-depth discussion of not only how China defines embodied AI, what China is doing in this space, including some very fascinating examples and challenges that China faces, as well as differences between the Chinese approach to artificial intelligence in general, as well as the US approach. Really appreciate both of you joining me today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonnie. It's been a huge pleasure.